Hello. Can you hear me now? Testing, testing, hello. Hello. Yeah, cool. Right, everyone can hear me now. Well, this has been fun, hasn't it? Yes, sorry about that. I forgot that, one, I forgot to hit go live, and which was a bit of a problem. And then two, once I'd gone live, I forgot that when I move the microphone from computer to computer, it mutes itself. So, that's good. Good start anyway. So, slightly different setup this time. Let me just correct that. There we go. So yes, you might notice a few new additions to the display collection. I'll go over those a little bit later. And what's this setting say? Okay, that seems all to be in order. All right, so same format as last time, since that all seemed to go pretty well. So I'll work through the alternate history and speculative questions from June's Patreon questions, and then we will start taking questions from the rest of the audience. But just to begin with, so that you know what the new additions are, courtesy of one of the subscribers, there is a sea mine now, living happily in its jar. Then we also have a Vosper launch. That was acquired, I can't remember exactly where, but it actually motors around quite happily in water, which is cool. This box contains a bunch of glass slides, which I will be digitizing and uploading over the next week or so. And these two are brass gun turrets. So yeah, this one's a 15-inch and this one's a 6-inch. This one is an apprentice's model, which has a nice storage place in it. And this one is very special because, I don't know if the resolution is good enough to see it, but this one is a model of the twin 6-inch mount from HMS Rodney, cast from the brass of HMS Rodney. So yes, that's all good. Right, so today I have the questions on tablet instead of on paper because that would be a huge waste of paper otherwise. So let's get onto it. Here we go. So Cypher asks, it's 1990 and apparently I'm in the US Navy with a combined carrier battle group and surface action group heading towards the Persian Gulf when somehow I get hit by the same magic as the final countdown and I get transported into the Pacific in March 1940. How would I utilise my fleet in the war, assuming fuel, ammunition and supplies are still of a concern? So I've got Theodore Roosevelt, Missouri, 3 Aegis cruisers, 4 frigates, 2 destroyer squadrons, 2 attack subs and 2 resupply ships. Well, that's quite fun, isn't it? Well, technically, as a US officer at that point, I can't actually get involved in the war before America officially declares war, at least as far as anything can be traced back to me. So, yeah, that is going to be an interesting one. So what I would do, I would sail to... well, if I'm heading towards the Persian Gulf, so I would sail back to the States. I'd probably just do a 180, go back that way. However, this is me, so I have forward knowledge. So I'd sail back to the States with a warning about what's going to have to happen to Pearl Harbor, but I would detach I would detach my 2 attack submarines, and I would send them over to the Atlantic where... because this is March 1940, so they would then sail around the Atlantic for a little while, and mysteriously German raiders raiding capital ships like Scharnhorst and Eisenhower and Bismarck would just magically explode, and nobody knows why. And then I would incidentally mention a few months later that I happen to have some attack submarines, but never mind. So yes, I would then use that to set up, well, it depends how it goes there, because if you come in with warning to the US that actually this is all going to happen, Pearl Harbor's going to happen, they may want to open the assault, in which case, if you open the assault, then great. If they want to go with letting, well, not letting Pearl Harbor happen, but letting the attack be launched, and then being having an ambush, well, if you can imagine half a dozen modern warships with SM2s and CIWS systems versus the incoming Kido Butai striker, well, that will put the Japanese carrier arm down pretty well. And of course, by December 41, the attack subs will have had to come home for resupply, so you could have both of them following the Kido Butai. So as soon as the Japanese launch their airstrikes and get them in the air, you just put torpedoes into the submarine. You put the torpedoes from the submarine into the carriers. So you sink the Kido Butai once their airstrikes are off. Then you shoot down the airstrikes, and anyone who somehow manages to survive doesn't have a carrier to go back to. At which point, you've pretty much solved the Pacific War there and then. Everything else is just wrapping it up, really. Go and help out the Royal Navy at that point. So that would be quite fun. Memori asks, if the Chinese Beiyang fleet was able to secure continuous funding without all the corruption, what are the chances a well-trained and supplied Beiyang fleet could beat the Japanese at a battle equivalent to the historical one at the Yellow Sea or Yalu River? Might be some interesting repercussions. Yes, given that the two battleships the Chinese had, although they were technically speaking obsolete, still proved basically near enough impossible to kill for the Japanese cruisers just because they were so heavily armoured. If those ships are properly funded, properly trained, and properly equipped with the correct shells and such like, they can probably break the Japanese fleet because they'll have more than enough time to start landing shots that actually matter. And that's before we get into the rest of their fleet. But the thing is, even if they're properly armed and supplied, the rest of the Chinese fleet is still kind of on the same playing field as the Japanese fleet. So it evens things up a bit, but it's not decisive. Whereas those two battleships, if they're able to be fully equipped and fully ready and properly trained, that basically puts the battle firmly in the Chinese hands, regardless of almost anything bar extreme circumstances. Now, if that happens and the Japanese fleet is either beaten off or largely crippled and sunk, I mean, that has significant implications on the Sino-Japanese War at the time in and of itself, and also has quite interesting implications going forward. Now, the big question is whether the Japanese then decide that this whole overseas adventurism has really gotten a bit out of hand and they go back into reclusion for a while, which could happen, or they might double down and decide that now we definitely need battleships, which, I mean, it's going to stretch their economy a lot, and they were aiming to have a lot of battleships anyway, but if they've got a more battleship heavy fleet, then it could have interesting implications for some form of Russo-Japanese war, but I don't actually think the Russo-Japanese war in 1904 is likely, because the Japanese will probably be more aiming to come back for round 2 of, well, or round whatever it is these days of the Sino-Japanese wars. There have been so many. So that is that question. Now we have Oddball 0311. What effects would the US joining the war in 1940, following the invasion of Norway, have on the Battle of the Atlantic and operations in the Mediterranean? Assume Admiral King is an Anglophile. Okay. How much opium did we give him? What ships do we think the US Navy would send over other than the much needed escort vessels for convoys? That's an interesting one, actually, because bear in mind at this point a lot of the US fleet is stuck, well, not stuck, they are in the Pacific because they're worried, and as it turns out very rightly worried, about Japan. there's relatively few US Navy ships in the Atlantic, and with the best will in the world, even if they're joining the war, they're not going to diminish the Pacific Fleet all that much. They might pull a few of the older battleships off, and there were one or two battleships and a couple of carriers in the Atlantic Fleet anyway. The main impacts are going to be on convoys because, well, convoy escorts will definitely be a thing, especially with the various sort of Wicks and Clemson class destroyers they can reactivate. I can't see the US, as I say, with the worries they've got about the Pacific, I can't see them committing large forces to the Mediterranean, because once those ships in the Mediterranean, it's going to take quite a while to get them out. If they're with Cunningham in the Mediterranean fleets, especially rather than with Force H, they would either have to go via the Suez Canal all the way down around Africa and back up to the Atlantic, or across the Indian Ocean and across the Pacific Ocean. And if the Japanese do get into a war with the States, then as far as the US is concerned, from a strategic point of view, that's very bad if you're transitioning a small number of ships basically right in front of the Japanese fleet. So it would take a lot of time, theoretically you could try kind of hand off during a Malta convoy and get them out the Straits of Gibraltar, but then that means you might be thinking, I'm bringing back these ships because I need them just in time for the Luftwaffe to drop a couple of 2,000 pounders on them, and then they're in harbour. So yeah, I don't think the US is going to lend much of a hand in the Mediterranean. Convoy escort's definitely a thing. Maybe something like Ranger and or Wasp. And some of the others, maybe one or two of the other carriers, might be used to help supplement the home fleet. But I think possibly the biggest thing will be if the US is prepared to assign some of its older battleships like New York or Texas, etc., to convoy escort duty. So they're taking the place of ships like Rodney, Nelson, Malaya, etc., then that means those ships of the Royal Navy that were being used on convoy escort in the Atlantic, can then be redirected to the Mediterranean or Force H, one of the two. And that probably, apart from anything else, will have a fairly big impact, because the Royal Navy can then afford to be a lot more aggressive if it's got more of its own ships in the Mediterranean, because the US Navy is taking up some of the load in the Atlantic. So yeah, those would be the two primary impacts, I think, there. Let's have a look. What else? Class A Cornate asks, in the alt history mod Kaiserreich, that one again, where Germany won World War I, the way in which the blockade is broken in the law is the so-called Second Battle of Jutland, fought in November 1918. Although it's more fought in the planned Texel area, it involves Seymour performing one of the greatest scrupes in history, telling BT superiors they're not 50 miles off the coast of the Netherlands, but 50 miles off the coast of Norway. The entire high seas fleet then kills the British battle cruiser squadrons, as well as Hood, HMS Australia, and the 3 large light cruisers. Humour factor aside, is this at all feasible? Short answer, no. If the high seas fleet catches the battle cruiser fleet, then sure, that in and of itself is feasible, especially if they're caught in a relatively confined waters like that, where it's more difficult to extricate themselves. However, and this is a very big however, thank you, Osprey, for the Iron Brew Fund donation. That is very much welcome. But yes, the single biggest problem with that whole thing is that position reports don't come with country names attached. You wouldn't say, oh, we're 50 miles off the coast of Norway, even if you were, let alone if you're 50 miles off the coast of the Netherlands. Positional reports were given in latitude and longitude. So, and those are calculated not just on the spot, but also by a system of dead reckoning from the minute the ships leave port. Now that can lead to errors, and at the Battle of Jutland there were a number of errors, with their dead reckoning of various squadrons was out by several miles at various points. But no message is going to say Norway or Netherlands in it, unless it's maybe part of a ship name. It's going to be, we are at latitude XXX north, YYY east, and that'll be how they determine it. So for that to be so badly wrong as to give a position that they're 50 miles off the coast of Norway as opposed to off the coast of the Netherlands, well, those two figures, they don't even juxtapose. I mean, you're near the Greenwich Meridian, so I suppose if you're using with that, you can get an east-west a bit confused if you have the wrong negative in the wrong place, but still that would put you off the coast of Ireland, somewhere in the western approaches, rather than Norway. And the dead reckoning, well, put it this way, if the dead reckoning leaving from Rosyth was so badly out that they thought they were off of Norway instead of the Netherlands, they probably would have run aground somewhere already. So yeah, unfortunately that's not feasible. I mean, the idea of a communication screw-up giving the wrong idea of where the ships are is feasible, but not by that kind of margin. Not by a long way. Cypher asks, how well do you think the Imperial Japanese Navy would function in World War II without Yamamoto? Well, it's one of those interesting ones. Yamamoto is very good at fighting the corner for the Japanese Navy pre-war. He's very good at coming up with the initial plans and sort of an overall strategy. But then as time goes on, prior to some P-38s putting an end to his career, he starts passively, aggressively not micromanaging his fleets, i.e. he doesn't send them specific orders, he sends kind of, we suggest that you do this or that or the other, which is actually even worse. So without him completely, let's assume that he gets killed at the Battle of Tsushima or gets invalided out because he loses an extra finger. The Imperial Japanese Navy is probably not in quite as good a shape going into the war as it would have been, as it was with him. But at the same time, it's possible that various admirals who are probably somewhat better theatre commanders like Ozawa might be a step or two up the pecking order. But to be honest, it depends when you remove him, because if you remove him from play at the Battle of Tsushima, there's an awful lot of butterflies involved there. The best time, if you want the Japanese Navy to function as well as best it can, then probably you want Yamamoto to suffer a massive heart attack somewhere around March 1942. Brett McDowell, if you were cast as a somewhat benevolent god, trust me, if I was a god, I would not be on the benevolent side of things for a lot of people. But anyway, assuming that I am a benevolent god and could, for both World War I and World War II, remove from existence any one admiral from the major navies to give the biggest positive effect by taking out someone who was horrible or incompetent, who would it be for each navy? And to make things difficult, I'm not allowed to take out Beatty. Okay, so if I'm changing things to just remove somebody from play, for the Royal Navy, and this might cast the net a little bit wider than is necessarily intentional, but I think it's a good talking point, I would probably remove Admiral Fisher. And that might sound like heresy, but Admiral Fisher's time was good. His time in the 1900s was good. Some of his notions, like the large light cruisers and such, like in World War I, not so good. And also, there was a perfectly good admiral whose place he took, Prince Louis of Mountbatten. And basically, Prince Louis was a very good naval officer, very level-headed. He was forced out by circumstance because he had a German name, and it was basically racism that got rid of him. And they dusted off Admiral Fisher and put him back in his old place. Because at that point, well, you're going into a war. You don't want to put someone brand new to the position. You have to take someone who knows what they're doing already. So if you could, as a benevolent god, hand wave away that kind of attitude from the British public and media, so that Prince Louis retains his position. That would be my probably single largest change for the Royal Navy. For the French Navy, shockingly, as it may come to one or two of you, I would remove Admiral Jean-Soul with a prejudice, I would just eliminate him in a towering column of divine heavenly fire. And, well, anyone else almost could go in his position, because, to be honest, at that point, I don't even particularly care whether or not the French forces at Mers El Kabir join up with the Royal Navy or not. I just don't want that utter disaster and train wreck of an incident to go down the way that it did. Get someone slightly more reasonable and possibly slightly more free thinking in on the French side, and a lot of Frenchmen don't die, and that probably has a lot of beneficial knock-on effects. I say, even if they don't join up there and then with the Free French, as long as there's some equitable solution, most probably sailing to somewhere like Martinique and quote-unquote disarming themselves, it means that there's nowhere near as bad blood between the various French and British formations going forward, which is going to help a lot as the war progresses. There's also going to be, when a lot of the Free French units, the Vichy French Navy units start to join up with the Free French, like Richelieu did, then, well, you now have Dunkirk and Strasbourg, which would be very useful to have, along with a number of other ships. Yeah, there's a whole load of knock-on effects from that. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, it would probably be whoever's the one step above Admiral Ozawa. Get Admiral Ozawa further up the rungs as soon as possible, since he was probably one of, if not the best, tactical commanders that the Japanese had. For the German Navy, I'd actually get rid of Admiral Lütjens. Yeah, because although he did very well on the raid with Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, his command in Operation Rheinbogen is just not that good. Captain Lindemann has to take over a couple of times, like telling them to open fire at the Battle of the Denmark Strait, for example, plus his radio signals and stuff. So, yeah, I would actually remove Admiral Lütjens about maybe 2 months before Bismarck sails, so that somebody else gets a shot at that particular role. So that's the French, that's the Royal Navy, that's the Germans. The Italians is going to be like playing whack-a-mole, to be honest. So many of their upper level admirals are political appointees. You're going to have to take out more than one to get the decent ones into a position they could do something. But, well, you might as well take out Iachino. That's the start. Gets everyone else one step further up. For the US Navy, it's actually quite a difficult one, because if I'm allowed to target at a very specific time, then if it's very, very time specific, then I'd probably take out Halsey like a month before the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Admiral King, for all his faults and for all the fact he did hate the British, as I've said before, he was an absolute godsend for the US Navy in most respects. Not all, on convoy duties and anything to do with the Royal Navy, not so much, but for fighting the corner, for fighting the US Navy's corner, and for putting the fear of the divine into Buord once he got wind of what was going on with the Mark 14 torpedo, there's few better than Admiral King, so I definitely wouldn't get rid of him. I'd say I'd probably snipe off Halsey a month before Leyte Gulf, so that somebody who might actually put a covering force in the San Bernardino Strait will still be around. That may or may not be because I want to see what would happen when when Admiral Halsey's, well now not Admiral Halsey's, battleship escorts run up into Yamato and Nagato, because that would be a lovely battle for the ages. That was quite an interesting one, actually. Captain Landlocked asks, would something like Operation Sea Lion have been feasible during the First World War? Not during the original First World War, but there's quite a bit of a timeline divergence. So let's say the German army manages to conquer Paris in September 1914 and occupies France. Okay, would the Imperial Navy have been able to relocate their heavy units to France? Theoretically, yes. Practically, no. Because, well, the Royal Navy spent the better part of the last century working out how to take out and or blockade ships in the French ports across the Channel. They just need to dust those plans off, and they've got enough submarines and mine layers and stuff to completely box people in. Consequently, would they be able to fend off the Royal Navy for long enough to bring an invasion force to Britain and supply it afterwards? Again, no, because if they make that movement, they're putting themselves in a choke point, and the Royal Navy has ships dedicated, like the Harwich Force, dedicated to safeguarding the Channel, both the Harwich Force destroyers and cruisers, as well as a force in the Thames estuary made up of mostly pre-dreadnoughts. And whilst that's collectively probably not enough to stop the High Seas Fleet, it's enough to slow them down long enough for the Grand Fleet and the Battlecruiser Fleet to show up and completely wreck everything. So yeah, the Germans would never put the High Seas Fleet into a position of trying to force their way into the Channel, even if the French coast ostensibly belongs to them. It's far too much of a risk and puts them in far too much of a box. But that said, so we're assuming the French Navy is not in question. The Italians stay neutral. They're trying to invade in summer 1915. Russian and Baltic front's pretty much the same. The Ottomans don't commit any naval forces. The Austro-Hungarian Navy's on the defensive. It's basically down to that. How do you get the High Seas Fleet into the Channel? That's basically the Royal Navy. It's bearing in mind you've got Room 40 decoding everything. This is the Royal Navy's perfect scenario come to pass, because not only have the Germans put themselves into a very, very tight confined area where they can't run, they've also put themselves into a bottleneck where it's going to be practically impossible for them to extricate themselves even in a fighting retreat, because the British can just block it off. So the British would just force a decisive battle when they know the High Seas Fleet is making its move, and probably be toasting themselves all the way down. So, Sui420 Den asks, how viable was the Japanese plan to use I-400 submarines to strike the US West Coast with biological weapons? Viable as in, could they pull it off? Yes, theoretically. I mean, they did manage to firebomb a few places on the West Coast. Viable as in, was it a good idea? The very best they can hope for is they drop it somewhere where nobody notices, because everyone came away with a horror of chemical warfare from World War One. Biological warfare is the next step up. If you are going to use biological warfare on somebody, anybody really, but especially someone like the Americans, I mean, look how badly they reacted to Pearl Harbor, and that was with conventional weapons. But yeah, if you're going to go after someone with biological weapons, it's basically an all or nothing thing. You either have to make sure you so badly debilitate or wipe them out that they can't come back after you, or else they are going to be coming back after you, and when they come back after you, there is not going to be any mercy. And even if you had every single I-400 ever built, all lining up, all sending off all their possible aircraft, all loaded to the brim with a one-way trip's worth of biological weapons, that's still nowhere near enough to put anything like a significant dent in the US population. All you're going to do is, if at all possible, make the US even more determined to grind your civilization into the dust. So, yeah, no, just don't do that. Admiralty of Floof says, with regard to your closing sentence in the recent Regia Marina video with military history visualized, go and watch his videos if you get a chance, by the way. Suppose the Italians didn't enter World War II on either side. Everything involving the French fleet happens as happened until France turns Vichy. And how does this then play out? Can the Germans and French force entry into the Mediterranean, or does it become a British pond? How might that play out? Well, one of the things is that, bear in mind where Mers el Kabir was, one of the tangential concerns that the British had was about troops, Axis troops, trying to seize the French ships. Now, there weren't too many Axis troops in the adjacent territories to the French-held part of North Africa, but the ones that were Italian. So if the Italians are neutral, that removes one of the smaller pressures on the whole Mers el Kabir situation, which again might help it to resolve a bit more peacefully. But assuming that somehow that kind of goes down roughly the way it did, if the Italians don't enter World War II on either side, the Royal Navy is still going to have to keep a bunch of ships in the Mediterranean just in case, because they don't know. They don't have a 100% guarantee either way of what's going on. But it does free up a lot of ships, and also crucially shipping, because the shipping from the Indian Ocean across to the Atlantic and thus to the UK is a lot faster going via the Suez Canal and across a neutral Mediterranean than it is going all the way around Africa. So that actually improves the British supply situation quite significantly. And it also means that, well, the Germans don't have a launching point to send anything into North Africa, unless they want to try using Greece for some reason. But then the thing is that if Italy's neutral, they're not going to go into Greece, because they went into Greece to rescue the Italians, who in this scenario aren't doing anything. So they'd just be concentrating on going after Russia, which is probably bad news for Russia without the diversion of resources, men and equipment that headed off to Africa. And obviously for the British, they're not having to pour the amount of resources into defending Africa that they did. So the British have more men, more tanks, more artillery, more aircraft, and more ships on the home front and in the North Sea and the Atlantic. So overall, that's good for them. The only big downside will probably be that without the Mediterranean environment, this trying as it was, it means that some of the Royal Navy's expertise in things like radar-based night fighting, carrier operations, and in the more general form of the armed forces battle experience, all of which was gained on the North African fronts and in the Mediterranean, they're not going to get that, because let's face it, the Germans aren't going to be coming out for those kinds of sort of back and forth that the Italians were. So although the British will end up with a lot more resources available to them, they might not be able to utilize them in quite the same way that you might think, looking at how much experience they had going into the latter half of World War II historically. SDF7 asks, as with the book 1904, the idea of Imperial Germany invading the United States seems to keep turning up like a bad penny. At a gut level, I cannot imagine this would be logistically possible. If somehow they convinced the Kaiser to try it, what would be the rough order of battle in order for a landing to even be considered, and would any prospect of a sea lift be feasible? Would this only rely on the most delusional fever dreams of the Germanic fifth column seen later in the Wilsonian era? And for those of you asking questions in the chat, once I've got through this list, I'll start taking questions from the chat. So I will try and keep an eye on those, on some of those super chat questions and such. But there you go. It's taken me to the new YouTube Studio Live thing, so I'm not entirely sure how that's gonna work, but we'll see. Anyway, going back to 1904. The reason it keeps getting picked up in alternate history fiction is because the Kaiser actually did have a plan to do this. Bear in mind that early part of the 1900s. It's pre-Great White Fleet, pre-even half the build-up of the US Navy's pre-dreadnoughts. So that they had slightly more reason to think they'd win a naval engagement than you might think even 4 or 5 years down the line. In terms of whether or not they physically could do it, Germany's got a fair number of large liners, quite a lot of which ended up in Allied hands during the First World War. In theory, if they're planning for this, they could load a ton of troops onto their liners. If they get a dozen large liners, they could get sort of 5-figure troop numbers, at least on the liners, and with some supporting supply ships. The supply line's going to be completely horrific and almost unfeasible, but you could get a fairly surprisingly large initial force coming in. The US Army at that period, just coming off of the Spanish-American War, it's not the biggest and it's not the best equipped. So in absolute technical terms, the idea of the Germans putting their entire navy together, sailing up to the East Coast, targeting a big port like New York or Boston and showing up and landing with enough troops to take it over and such like, it's technically feasible. They've probably got enough ships to make a good fight of it, possibly even to win. But it's the old dog with a car chasing a car question. You've got your initial objective, now what are you going to do with it? Because, as a 1, your supply lines are going to be hilariously tenuous. 2, even if that we ignore that, yes, well done, you might have managed to land 30,000 men and take over a single American city. America's got a lot more cities and they've got a lot more men, so they're just not what are they going to do? They're just going to sit there and wait for the US to come at them with 10 times that number. It's kind of one of these plans which is kind of step 1, great. Step 2, step 3. What do you mean we need a step 4? Yeah. Elliot W. James. It is mid-September 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand has been assassinated and war has broken out in Europe. If the Germans adopt a purely defensive strategy in the West, thus the British Empire hasn't entered the war because of the German invasion of Belgium, which hasn't happened. Blah, 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 blah. 2 battle cruisers have been sent to reinforce von Spee's Pacific Squadron. So Goeben and Moltke in the Mediterranean, and the Austro-Hungarians have been conducting raids against the French. Using the Kiel Canal, the High Seas Fleet has moved from Wilhelmshaven and turned the Baltic into German Lake. Okay, this is a big one. So basically everything's gone horribly wrong for everyone except Britain. And France has launched an attack into the German defences. You're a member of the British Cabinet responsible for naval affairs. Some favour honouring the Treaty of London, ensuring Belgian neutrality and coming to the war on the side of the Germans because France has invaded Belgium. Others favour a war with Germany because they don't want Germany to take over Europe. What changes to Royal Navy dispositions would you make? Depends who we're going to war with. I mean, if this war's developed like this, then, well, if we're going to war with France as a navy, that's not too much of a problem because the Marine Nationale is quite small and quite under-equipped compared to the Royal Navy. We just sort of sail up and poke them until they come out and fight. They've got forces in the Mediterranean. I mean, obviously this is going to involve breaking the Entente Treaty, but that's something completely different. So yeah, I'd probably send a couple of battle squadrons of older vessels, maybe the King Edward VIII and Dreadnought and the Bellerophons, over into the Mediterranean with escorts to deal with the French Mediterranean forces, keep everyone else around to deal with the French Atlantic forces, and that's pretty much that. If we're going to war with Germany, we'll pretty much adopt the same strategy as historical. Prepare Scapa Flow and hope that they come out. The thing is, if they've got 2 battle cruisers out in the Pacific and they've got 2 battle cruisers in the Mediterranean, then I'm going to have to commit probably half my battle cruisers to the Mediterranean just to keep the Moltke and Goeben under control. The 2 in the Pacific, I'm probably just going to tell the Australians to get HMS Australia and join up with the Japanese with the Congos and go after them that way. Brian Roper asks, Imperial Germany doesn't go with the Mediterranean squadron and Goeben and Breslau remain with the High Seas Fleet. How do the earlier raids and clashes alter if Goeben is with the scouting force, for instance, at Dogger Bank? That actually does make quite a difference, because the reason Blücher was included there was because one of the battle cruisers was in Drydock for repairs, and they didn't want to go out with so few. If they go out with Goeben instead at Dogger Bank, then to be honest, the chances are, apart from Seydlitz catching an unlucky shell to one of the rear turrets, it's going to be pretty much of a muchness. The first scouting group will stay at long enough range that they don't take too many more hits as they retreat. You won't get the destruction of Blücher. Yeah, it's going to be a little bit of a damp squib, much more of a score draw. Seydlitz part slightly damaged, lines slightly damaged. That's pretty much that. The bigger change is going to be actually at Jutland, because if they've got Goeben, well, we know how the run to the south went for BT when he was 6 versus 5, since he left the 5th Battle Squadron behind. If it's 6 versus 6, I don't want to see what will be left of the battle cruiser fleet after that, to be perfectly honest. James Sean Moore asks, alternate timeline, Hitler and Stalin never break up. Hitler realises you can get oil from Russia by paying for it a lot easier, continues his conquest on the Western Front. Stalin somehow forces Japan out of China, appears to be planning an invasion of the home islands. Would Japan ally itself with the US and the UK, and if so, would the 3 navies be able to work together? The Japanese Navy didn't work well with the Japanese Army, and the Japanese Navy didn't even work well with the Japanese Navy. So, given the amount of tension that had built up in the 1920s and 1930s between the Japanese Navy and the US and UK navies, I can't see them just suddenly at the drop of a hat in a couple of years turning around and working really well with them. To be honest, if somehow the Soviets have forced Japan out of China, that does focus Japan's thoughts a bit more. But the US doesn't want Japan in China anyway, so they might be content to watch Japan and China and the Soviet Union batter each other. They're probably not going to really want to come and actively aid them. They might not embargo them to let them keep receiving oil so that they can fuel their war machine to keep battering away at the Russians. But I suspect the UK and US are probably just going to turn around and watch it go down, watch them weaken each other. Noob Lord to answer, yes, later, once I've got through this list of Patreon alternate history questions, and I'm trying to keep track of the various super chat questions as well, although quite how I do that in this I'm not entirely sure. I might have to switch to the, I don't know. Okay. I'll see what I can how I can find those questions later. Where are we? Oh, we're nearly there. So Graham R. Could Admiral Spey's East Asia squadron have had a bigger impact on the war if he'd instead sailed to German East Africa, assuming that crossing the Indian Ocean went smoothly with minimal losses and that he arrived in East Africa with his fleet mostly intact? On the other hand, would such crossing of the Indian Ocean even be possible? The reason von Spey didn't do this originally was because he was worried about running too close to the Australian Navy with their battle cruiser. If, say, he has a better idea that war's going to break out and he ducks out of Tsingtao early and skedaddles through that area past India just before war breaks out, officially, then he might make it to East Africa. The main problem is he's then boxed in because he can't go north, because if he goes north to be particularly a threat to India, then the British are going to send forces through the Suez Canal. They can't go through the Suez Canal because the British and French will be waiting for him on the other side. And actually there's a couple of battle cruisers, well, 3 battle cruisers as we know in the Mediterranean at the outbreak of war that go chasing off after Goeben and Breslau. Was it? No, 2, sorry. 2 battle cruisers. So they would probably get redirected to East Africa pretty darn sharpish. And as we know from the various German ships that did end up operating in that theatre, the British weren't averse to dispatching the odd pre-dreadnought either. So whilst initially he will probably have more success raiding commerce if he splits his ships up and tells them to go after the various sort of Australia to Suez, India to Suez, etc. trade links, he'll have a lot of initial success there because the British forces in the area just aren't strong enough to stop him. So economic-wise, it'd be a good few weeks - months, but then very quickly you'll probably end up with, once Goben's been bottled up, you'll end up with a couple of battle cruisers and a squadron of armoured cruisers coming down from the Mediterranean, plus Australia and its ships, its escorts coming in from Australia, at which point there'll be a huge force showing up to blockade him and possibly force him into action. So yeah, it's kind of a better start, but earlier and worse finish. Kristen asks, how do you rate various naval fiction writers for accuracy and readability? That one I'd probably have to, she does mention, might have to go into a special. That might well have to go into a special. Oh yeah, sorry if the rain, is the rain a bit too much? Sorry, it started raining. It is England after all. If it gets too loud, let me know in the chat, and I might have to figure out some way of moving this whole contraption indoors. Not that I look forward to that, because I have to reposition everything, but we'll see. Just rain, go away. Yes. Anyway, naval fiction writers, accuracy and readability. To be honest, I haven't read too much naval fiction. There's the standard go-tos of Hornblower and Master and Commander, but yeah, I mean, to be honest, I would have to look into perhaps some other people's recommendations and filter them through myself, because yeah, as I just haven't read that much naval fiction, certainly not for a long time. And some of the stuff I have read, I definitely wouldn't recommend. Robert Henry Ilston, how influential was the success of the invasion of Normandy and invasion of France, both of which were pretty large gambles that on paper should not have succeeded, in the planning of Operation Sea Lion and the invasion of England? Why were the dice never thrown, considering the gambler's luck that Germany had before taking high-risk, high-reward operations? I mean, to a certain extent, when you gamble that you can Anschluss Austria without repercussion, and then you can first take part of and then all of Czechoslovakia without repercussion. Oh no, there's a helicopter now. Great. Why? It's raining. Go away. Find someone else to bother. Anyway. Yes, so yeah, you've got that. Then the invasion of Poland succeeds, invasion of France succeeds. You think you're rolling natural sixes, so or natural 20s, depending on which particular game system you're playing. But when it came to Operation Sea Lion, I mean, the idea was always going to be chancing it. The two main problems were, one, the absolutely devastating losses the Kriegsmarine took during the invasion of Norway, which rendered any idea of the Kriegsmarine trying to escort the invasion fleet over pretty much a laughable joke at best. But it also actually involved the Kriegsmarine, who tended to be a little bit more level-headed at times. So why the dice were never thrown? Basically because everyone was pretty clear that you needed to... You absolutely had to try and get at least air superiority, if not naval superiority, and really both. And they couldn't get one, let alone the other. Hypertron DE says there was no gambling for Poland. Poland had zero chance of surviving. Yes, but the dice rolls with Poland was that it went as well as it did, and that initially the dice roll which failed was that Britain and France wouldn't back up their claims to mandate Polish sovereignty, but where the gamble paid off there was that whilst Britain and France did declare war, they weren't really able to do anything to help Poland all that much. Now, where are we? John Grobard, Alternative History. Halsey does detach Task Force 34 and it meets up with the Japanese Central Force. How would this have come about, i.e., or how would it have gone down? So this is what Halsey said he was going to do, but then didn't. Probably very badly for the Japanese. I mean, ironically enough, the Japanese are probably going to end up sinking more US ships than they did in the historical Battle of Samar because, well, they're going to be shooting AP shells at ships that are actually big enough to absorb AP shells that will then detonate inside them rather than passing through them. But when you look at the task matchup, the number of modern battleships, including Iowa class, that the US has, plus, of course, the 3 Taffy forces will then be sitting back quite happily, loading off aircraft and the number of destroyers available, etc. Outside of multiple natural 20s, it's going to end up with a slaughter where the Japanese task force is either sent to the bottom or sent running to be hunted down by aircraft shortly thereafter. But there are a few. There are going to be some US ship losses. Exactly what those are, and whether it's a few ships lost or a larger number of ships damaged, that's something you'd have to very carefully war game out. Because the thing is, okay, with the Congos, it's fairly easy to point out they don't really stand too much of a chance. Nagato it's got a good chance of dealing damage out, but it's not very well protected by the standards of World War II. So I wouldn't. It's not definitely not going to survive. It can damage ships, but it's just not got the firepower to really put them down. There's enough US cruisers and destroyers to screen off the Japanese cruisers and destroyers from getting in long launch strikes. The big one in this whole scenario is Yamato. How much damage does it take before it stops functioning as an effective combat unit? Because if it gets a couple of good salvos in with those 18.1 inch guns and lands some hits, that's going to hurt anything it hits at the kind of ranges the battle's going to be fought at. It doesn't matter whether it's a cruiser or an Iowa or anything in between, it's going to hurt. But hey, variety is the spice of life. Benjamin Lacrone asks, very interesting what-if scenario where the Japanese fleet engages the US's Great White Fleet due to America's immigration policies and anti-Asian riots. Had that occurred as the Great White Fleet neared Japan in October 1908, what do you believe the outcome would have been, both in the initial engagement and the ensuing war? What would Britain's role have been? That's an interesting one. The thing is, 16 US battleships, okay, fair enough, they don't have any support to help against cruisers and destroyers, but 16 US battleships is still substantially larger than the battle line the Japanese are really going to be able to put together. So that's a bit of a problem for them. However, they do have a bit of a chance because of this lack of escort and screening, and of course it's probably going to be a surprise as well. So yeah, that battle is going to be very interesting. I guess this is where we'll see just how good the secondary and tertiary batteries of pre-dreadnoughts are at defending themselves from cruisers and destroyers. I really wouldn't want to initially put a bet on the outcome, because the traditional battle line side of things is going to be very much in the US's favour. But with those escorts potentially ruining everything with torpedoes, I wouldn't want to 100% bet on that. And it really depends how that engagement goes, because if the engagement goes really badly and the Great White Fleet is sunk, the US basically doesn't have a fleet left that can prosecute the war for at least another 3 or 4 years. Now, fair enough, when they do prosecute the war, they're going to show back up with dreadnoughts and like the very, very few pre-dreadnoughts that were left. So it will look like a much, much more extended version of the World War II Pacific campaign. But yeah, that's one side of things. It could be the Japanese fleet gets badly mauled anyway, at which point it's kind of, well, the war's almost over before it's begun. What would Britain's role have been? It depends if the Japanese can spin it as the US attacked them, because the British are Japanese allies at this point. So if the Japanese can somehow convince everyone that America attacked Japan, then Britain would have to get involved, theoretically. But if it's more likely, it's more obvious that the Japan took an opportunity to snipe at the Americans, the British don't have to get involved. The one thing the Americans would have a problem with is coaling, which is another problem they did have in the Great White Fleet's voyage anyway. But to be fair, if the Americans are coming back with dreadnoughts in 2 to 3 years' time, they'll have the time to build up colliers as well. And as I say, if they win the fleet battle straight off, then there isn't really going to be much of a war. Glenn Ricafrente asks several questions regarding aircraft carriers overshadowing battleship, and says pick one. Okay. When did the carrier clearly supplant the battleship as the main naval strike force, not just theoretically or technically, but doctrinally, politically, psychologically, and as a proven concept you could build and reconfigure your navy around? Probably 1942, I would say. The thing is, whilst a lot of people can point to, obviously, Pearl Harbor and Force Z, the capability, and Force Z wasn't carriers for a start, but the capabilities of aircraft to strike ships increased dramatically in the late 1930s. There's a huge gap between the capabilities of aircraft carriers in, say, 1937, 1938 and what their capabilities are at the end of 1941. And bear in mind that for the British, their carrier force in terms of aircraft and tactics, and not so much tactics, but especially in terms of aircraft, is almost frozen in 1939, just before they're supposed to get a bunch of fairly interesting aircraft. Whereas Japan and the US have 2.5 years almost to continue to upgrade their carriers. And as I've said before, you look at the aircraft loadout of a Yorktown or a Cargi or one of the Lexingtons in mid-1939 and compare it to their loadout at the end of 1941, beginning of 1942, there's huge differences. So, yeah, I would say that as far as the carrier becoming the preeminent tool, at least in open ocean engagements like the Pacific, you're probably looking at, 42-ish. In closer in engagements like the Mediterranean or the North Sea or the Arctic convoys, carriers become a key part of those engagements, I think probably actually earlier, probably right at the beginning, probably late 1930s, when carrier fighters and radar get to a point where they can actually make reasonable intercepts. But they're a key component. They're not supplanting and overawing the battleship, and that situation probably doesn't actually change until much later in the war. Okay, so four quick ones, and we're on the last page of Patreon questions. So, Jeffrey Cook asks, Dreadnought versus questions, HMS St. Vincent versus SMS Helgoland, Orion versus Koenig, Dreadnought versus Nassau, and Florida versus Kaiser. St. Vincent versus Helgoland I would probably put on a coin toss. Orion versus Koenig, I would probably put my money on Orion because the 13.5-inch shells just hit that much harder. The Koenigs are good, but, well, we can see the effect of 11 and 12-inch hits on relatively decent armour, things like Lion and Tiger at Jutland, and it's not massively impressive when it's not breaching battle cruiser turrets and such like. Whereas we can also see the effect of even the poorly detonating 13.5-inch shells on German ships, and although it's difficult to sink, it's more easy to knock them out. So I would say Orion versus Koenig in sort of 1914 to 1916, I'd probably put my money on Orion. Dreadnought versus Nassau, Dreadnought. It's got the speed, it's got the firepower, protections. Well, on balance, Dreadnought actually has better protection because although its armour is not quite as thick or as extensive as Nassau's, it's only got to stand up to Nassau's 11-inch guns, whereas Nassau's got to stand up to Dreadnought's 12 inches. Florida versus Kaiser. Now that's an interesting one because speed's pretty much the same. Kaiser's got an armour advantage. Florida has a firepower advantage. But Florida's also stuck with American World War I gunnery, so I'd say maybe 55-45 Kaiser, maybe 60-40 Kaiser. If Florida can get, if this is Florida 1918, when it's got some Grand Fleet gunnery training in place, maybe I'd flip that round to give Florida the edge. Just about. Just because I've got lots of guns. Warren Jervey, what would have been the effect on the Battle of the Atlantic under the following two scenarios? Prior to the start of World War II, Kriegsmarine adopts its own non-Enigma code the Allies are not able to break. And 2, Kriegsmarine uses Enigma up to Pearl Harbor and thereafter adopts a code which wouldn't be broken. Very bad things. I mean, when I did my visit to the Western Approaches, it just comes home just how much of a knife edge things were on in early 1943, and that was with a limited capacity to break Enigma codes. If, in either case, if the Kriegsmarine has codes that can't be broken around that late 42, early 43 period, it makes coordinating against the wolf packs a lot harder. And it's possible that the Battle of the Atlantic might be lost. I mean, without the codes being read, the thing is it's going to affect how the British and later the Americans adopt their tactics, and the stuff that would eventually just force the U-boats down completely, i.e. mass numbers of escorts, lots of radar, advanced tactics developed by the Wrens in the tactical unit, lots of escort carriers, all this kind of thing. They're all coming. They're just a fraction later. So it's possible that the Atlantic might be closed briefly, but with those other things coming online, it would reopen by the end of 43, I think. It would be a lot harder, but it would still happen. Whether or not Britain can sustain being in the war with the Atlantic effectively closed for much of 43 is another question. Alan Millard, it's December 25th, 1926, and you wake up in the body of Emperor Hirohito. You have all current knowledge and all of his knowledge. What can you do to prevent World War II or improve its outcome for Japan? Oh, I can't prevent World War II because I can't really do anything to stop Germany going all out. How do I improve the outcome for Japan? Well, that's the problem, because Japan wants to expand. To expand, it needs to invade people. To invade people, it's exerting its sort of control in the Western Pacific. America doesn't like that. America puts on an oil embargo. A Japanese economy crashes. Yeah, there's not a tremendous amount that you can do to get around that, short of somehow persuading the Japanese to stop all their advances and conquests dead, which I really don't think is going to happen. Yeah, it's going to be difficult there. I mean, improving the outcome for Japan, obviously, as the Emperor, I can claim divine inspiration and give a bunch of information about my knowledge of what happened in the Pacific, like what happens at Coral Sea, what happens at Midway, blow by blow, which will theoretically allow those battles to end much better for Japan. The problem is that by doing so, I inherently change the war. So the more changes I make, the less useful my future knowledge is. Probably assuming that America's going to get involved in the war, the two single biggest changes I can make is tell the Japanese Navy that on December 7th, the carriers aren't going to be in Pearl Harbor, so they would have to reschedule for days where they were, and probably at Midway. Well, the thing is, even Midway is probably not going to happen if I pull that off, but if it somehow still does at Midway, just tell them to make sure the dive bombers have a cap coming after them. Ben asks, SSV Normandy versus space battleship Yamato, who would win? Well, I played Mass Effect and I like the Normandy. Normandy has Commander Shepard, so Normandy. Bill Brockman, with the benefit of hindsight, you're put in charge of ship-mounted anti-aircraft weapons in either the Royal Navy or US Navy in the late 1930s. You have authority to adopt any weapon system from around the world and put it into production. What do you choose for heavy and light anti-aircraft and fire control? Problem is the Mark 37 is, well, in the US you've got the Mark 37 coming online. It's a very closely guarded secret. Basically, I would just try and grab the patents for the 20mm Orlikon and the 40mm Bofors as fast as possible and just start their deployment as soon as possible. In the Royal Navy, I'd just say the 4.5-inch gun, lots and lots and lots of those. That would basically be the single biggest change I could make. And also put some tracer rounds in the pom-poms. For heavy AA, actually, I'd probably also just say, look, just build more 4.5 inches, forget the 5.25s for the Royal Navy. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, the Royal Navy and the US Navy generally did pretty good in their development of anti-aircraft. It was just a bit slow, so it's basically what they did, but faster, circumvent the dead ends. Admiral Tiberius, how much of an effect would it have had on the Allied Pacific campaign if the Mark 14 and other related torpedoes from the start had a 75 to 80% success rate rather than the 15 to 20% success rate they had in the first few years? How many more Japanese ships would have been sunk or forced in for repairs, and could it have shortened the war? It could have hugely shortened the war. There were a lot of torpedoes launched at a lot of very important Japanese ships early on in the war, especially around the invasion of the Philippines. It's probably not going to stop Japan in its tracks before Midway, but it's going to seriously damage a lot of the Japanese fleet and or sink ships. So rather than Midway being kind of a morale turning point where the US Navy knows they can beat the Japanese, but then you've got hard fights at things like Santa Cruz, Guadalcanal, etc., Midway might at that point very well be the last gasp of an effective combined Japanese fleet, because so many of their lesser ships and some of the bigger ones would have been either knocked out of action temporarily or sunk permanently by various torpedo strikes. So yeah, it probably would shorten the war by at least a year, I would say. Wow, why is there a discussion about statues and slavery and modern politics in the chat? Please stop. I'm not going to get involved, apart from saying please stop. Anyway, where were we? When did the carrier... right, sorry, is that the same lot of questions? Yes, that is the same lot of questions. So, I believe that is... Now I've got... Oh, some of you might remember the old Roman Navy specials where I rapid fire about a dozen questions that he put into comments. I do have one of those, but I'm going to focus on the comments for a bit. Right. Live chat. Right, there were some things. All right, I am going to try and switch from the current YouTube live studio to Studio Classic, because that will allow me to pick up on the super chat questions, which the new system doesn't seem to want me to do. So let's see how this goes. Aha, hello. Right. Where are we? I think I've made it over into the old one. Ah, here we go. Possibly. Yes. Yes. Success. Huzzah. Are we still here? Yes. Cool. Sorry, no, it's just because the new YouTube live streaming control panel doesn't let me see the super chats. The old one does, but I wasn't sure if hitting go back to the old one would end the stream or whatever. So I'm still here. This is good. Right. So let me quickly pick up on the super chat questions that I missed while I was going through the Patreon ones, and then we'll get on to everybody else's. Jade of Arc, thank you very much. That's just this contribution. Lots of people sending money for the Iron Brew Fund. That's very kind of you. The Dying Titan asks, what is the most overlooked thing in battleship design besides logistics? He says, I think torpedo defense systems, because the Iowas, South Dakotas and Yamatos all had issues but are generally held up as very good ships. Torpedo defense is actually usually very overlooked, other than when people point to ships that took a torpedo hit and it didn't go very well for them, and then they laugh at them. So yeah, I would say torpedo defense definitely. Although it's changing now, I would also say seakeeping and stability from a gun platform perspective are also quite badly overlooked in a lot of cases, because that does have a huge impact on whether or not you can even use the guns in heavy sea states, and whatever sea state you're using the guns in, whether those guns are going to be accurate. Because both the ship that rolls has a very long rolling period, kind of doing this, is going to be an awful gun platform, but also a ship that's far too stable, that kind of just whips back and forth, is also a bad gun platform. So I think those are definitely badly overlooked. Animals16365 asks, is it one of the problems that both Germany and Japan, in terms of naval capability, was their lack of shipyards, both to build and repair warships? Yes, to a degree. More so for Germany. Japan had a number of large building slips, but it was still limited compared to someone like the US or the UK. But they did have a fair number. And you look at the number of carriers they actually managed to produce during the Second World War. It was a fairly substantial number. Germany had very few very large shipyards. I mean, this is one of the problems that any kind of recent naval power, or power that is where naval concerns are secondary, is that they just don't tend to have enough shipyards. The Germans, I mean, you can even look at the French. The French were having to build ships in sections without bows and sterns for some of their capital ships, and then attach them later, just because the slipways they had just weren't long enough to build them as one piece. The Germans, like say with the Z plan, everyone goes on about H-44 and all this kind of thing, but after about the H-41 design revision, anything after that was physically too large for them to build in their yards. Now, fair enough, they could have tried something like the French did, but the Germans had enough problems with the sterns falling off without making them an optional extra on the original build. And yeah, that does translate into repairing warships as well, because if you've only got so many dry docks that can take ships of a large size, well, A, you're only going to build so many, and B, if they get damaged, you better hope that more than one or two don't get damaged at any given time. Where are we? We're still here. Cool. Frank Sposato, post-Samar Kurita versus Task Force 34 with only 2 Iowas, 8 light cruisers and 8 destroyers. Kurita destroys to break through San Bernardino to escape. Oh, that's a good one. Because post-Samar, Kurita still got his... I mean, a lot of his cruisers are gone or badly damaged, and a lot of his... Sorry, my sheepskin's fallen off the back. A lot of his... a lot of his lighter stuff's gone, but his heavy units are still there. And 2 Iowas, to be on the safe side, you'd want those 2 Iowas to gang up on Yamato, which then means you've only got 3 light cruisers and 8 destroyers to face off against 2 Congos, Nagato, and whatever else is left. Oh, that's going to be a really dicey one, actually. It's going to depend on how quickly Yamato is rendered combat ineffective, because if Yamato gets some early hits in and forces one of the Iowas out of action, a one-on-one slugging match between 1 Yamato and 1 Iowa is going to last a while. And yeah, with the best will in the world, short of those 8 destroyers deciding to all be USS Johnston and sort of as a squadron hold off Kongo, Haruna and Nagato, that's probably not going to end too well. And to be perfectly honest, Nagato would probably be well advised to help Yamato deal with the Iowas, whilst the 2 Congos, which ultimately our battle cruisers, do exactly what battle cruisers are designed for and go after the light cruisers, with the remaining Japanese cruisers and destroyers trying to just deal with those others. So yeah, that would have been a really nasty fight. So what else have we got? I don't think the camera angle is shifting. The box the camera's on is gradually collapsing. So yeah, anyway. Thank you very much, Christopher Marr, and Radovic Drobotchnak, I think. And Kevin McTaggart. Archangel Glenn, assuming all crews are equally trained, in your opinion, a battle between Colorado, Nagato and Nelson, who would win? So it is a bit of a difficult one. I've looked at that before. In terms of overall firepower, I mean, it's going to depend on the exact time period, because obviously, if you do it in the 1920s, the Nelsons have a disadvantage because their main battery doesn't work particularly well. Of the three, and when you look at speed, protection, and firepower, Colorado is the slowest, but is sort of a midpoint on protection. And firepower, I mean, they're all 16-inch gunships. Yes, Nelson's got one extra gun, but slightly lighter shells. So firepower, they're pretty much all on a level. Let's say speed-wise, Nagato's the fastest, Nelson's middle, Colorado's slowest. Protection, Nelson's the best protected, then Colorado, and Nagato is least well protected. So all else being equal, I'd say it's probably a coin toss between Colorado and Nelson, largely on the grounds that although engagement ranges have moved out a fair bit, they haven't moved out quite far enough in the 1920s and early 30s for Nagato to make use of her superior speed as much as she maybe could in World War II. And it's also pre-refit. And her armor is such that, whereas with Colorado and Nelson, if either of those takes a 16-inch shell hit to their main belt or any other aspects of their main protection, that there is a decent chance the belt armor does its job. Whereas, 11-inch belt on Nagato's at any practical battle range isn't really going to resist incoming shell fire, so Nagato becomes more of a glass cannon. And then it's down to kind of this coin toss between Colorado and Nelson. The advantage that Nelson has is very fractionally more speed, but that's probably not enough to make too much odds. The main advantage that Nelson has is that it can fire its entire main battery with a relatively small target profile because of its all-forward armament. Colorado has to expose itself a bit more to fire all of its battery, which makes it slightly easier to hit. So maybe just fractionally Nelson, but in the 1920s, in the 1920s, when Nelson's still having trouble with its main guns, I put it on Colorado, with it gradually tending towards Nelson as those gun issues are fixed. Frank Sposato, is it possible to know exactly how many heavy caliber shells each nation in each war and thus altogether were built? It is possible to know because the production records exist and can be broken down by caliber. It would require a heck of a lot of research, though. I think I know roughly where I'd look for the numbers for the US, the UK, Germany, France. Maybe. I think I know where to start with Italy. With Japan, I don't know if they managed to torch those particular records. So, yeah. Don't know with that one. Zachary asks, the Russians have limited sea access. Ooh. Where's Zachary's question gone? The Russians have limited sea access, but many railways. Did they ever disassemble their ships in the Baltic Sea and move them by rail to the Black Sea? Not disassemble entire ships. They did build a number of ships in component modules on the Baltic and move them to the Black Sea. So they weren't ever fully assembled, but they did do a few sort of modular builds and move those across. Thank you, Rita Loy and Bob and the Raptor Joe. Bob, the Raptor and Joe, even. Raz9810. If the Japanese were hell-bent on taking Sri Lanka during the Indian Ocean sweep, would this be successful? What would the British response be, and what would the consequences be on a strategic level? Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as it was called back then, the main problem the Japanese would have is that the troop convoy is going to be a heck of a lot slower than their kind of Indian Ocean raid operational units, which are carriers and Congos. So yeah, if they're hell-bent on doing it, it's going to be a lot more obvious initially, and with the troop convoy being so much slower, the Japanese naval force is going to face with the problem of, do they retain their strategic mobility and stay much more of a threat, or do they try and stick close to the convoys as escorts? Because if they retain their strategic mobility, there's a chance the British might outmaneuver them and hit the troop convoy. If they tie themselves into the troop convoy, then hitting the troop convoy becomes much more difficult, but it means it's much more easy for the British to hit them, period. If the Indian Ocean raid turns into towards an invasion of Sri Lanka, the British are going to have to, Somerville's forces are going to have to counterstrike, and hard. What the consequences on a strategic level would depend quite a lot on how that battle goes down, because to a certain extent, unlike the hypotheticals for the Indian Ocean raid, it could go either way. You could have the British fleet get caught out by the Japanese carriers in the middle of the day, and that's pretty much that. Or you could have the Royal Navy getting a successful night strike off. And to be honest, a successful night strike on the Japanese fleet, if it's escorting the convoy, and then getting things like HMS Warspite with radar and searchlights in amongst the troop convoy, that's not a pleasant situation you want to be in. Kevin McTaggart, what are the physics behind how anchors work? It depends what kind of anchors you're using. Whether you're using anchors that are physically dug into the seabed, or whether you're using anchors that are just suspended in the ocean and you're using their weight and various physics effects to stabilize your vessel. Anchors are probably actually an entire Wednesday special, so yeah, there's a lot of complex physics behind them once you move beyond the simple is stuck in ground kind of thing. He also asks, how do ships know to cut power when reversing so they don't hit something without the use of tugs? Judgment, basically. This is why helmsmen are very skilled people. You know roughly how fast your ship is moving, you know roughly how much time it takes to slow your ship down or stop it with certain given applications of power from the engines. So yeah, it's in a way it's kind of like a much larger, much slower version of reversing a car. The car is the same thing. You put the brakes on, but you're not going to stop immediately. You have to learn about stopping distances and such. Like, it's just a lot bigger and a lot more dangerous when you're doing it on a ship. Cool. George Warren, thank you very much. I will buy some more Iron Brew. William Kruger asks, you recently answered a question about quad turrets. What makes them so hard to get right? Aren't they simply triples plus one? To a certain degree, but that kind of highlights the problem, because triples were fairly complicated to get sorted. I mean, the twin turret that in various iterations had been working since the 1860s, but the triple turret really only comes into play in the 1910s, or well, late 1900s technically. It's the greater technological complexity. I mean, with a twin turret, there's two sets of equipment to go wrong. With a triple, there's 3. With a quadruple, there's 4. So that immediately makes things more likely to break down in some way, shape, or form. It's like if you've got 4 guns in a turret, it's more likely you're going to have one of them stop working than it is if you've got 2 guns, just from a statistical perspective, if each gun has the same kind of failure rate. The other thing is weight, because the amount of weight that is involved with a turret, its armor, the guns, etc., is huge. And I mean, Yamato's turrets weighed more than the average World War II destroyer. In fact, weighed more than almost any World War II destroyer. And that amount of force, you're talking about high hundreds to low thousands of tons. That needs a hugely powerful and complex set of machinery to move and maintain. So those kind of things can break very easily, because if they're very, very, very slightly out of alignment, not taken care of, etc., there's an awful lot of force that will very quickly break things. And a triple turret adds the weight of an entire another gun and all the armor protection you need for the extra volume. A quad is even more. So the amount of stress that's exerted on the turret fixtures and fittings is much larger, and if you haven't got it quite right, well, with more force comes an easier breakage. So yeah, size, weight, and complexity. Archangel Glenn, assuming that... Oh, that's the same question. I'm sorry. UNSC forward onto Dawn. Suppose in autumn 1942 the Royal Navy agrees to send Warspite and Valiant to help out at Guadalcanal. How does this affect the campaign, and how would the naval battles with the Congos go if they were present? Well, neither Warspite nor Valiant is going to have electrical issues like South Dakota did, and both Warspite and Valiant being present at Battle of Cape Matapan are much more familiar with the hunt the enemy by night with radar, switch on all searchlights at the last possible moment, and blast away at short range. The main problem is that neither of them are as fast as South Dakota. On a good day, they might actually be as fast as Washington if Washington doesn't want to tumble dry itself to death because, obviously, of the North Carolina's vibration issues, although they were on their way to fixing them by that point. But yeah, they still have a speed issue. They can't go as fast as Washington can if it has to. So yeah, their speed may well be a hampering issue, but in terms of the naval battles themselves, they're much, much better equipped for night fighting, much more experienced for night fighting, and so probably what you'll have is, well, yeah, Warspite and Valiant probably are going to go hunting, I would suspect. They'll be creeping around and then blowing things out of the water. It will be very amusing and entertaining to watch, especially because at this point you're talking about autumn 42 HMS Valiant. There's a fairly good chance Prince Philip is still there. He'll be chalking off the various nations that he's blown ships out of the water from in night actions with a searchlight. Like, right, Matapan done the Italians, Guadalcanal, that's the Japanese, and then he'll be very disappointed to find out that he's not allowed to go and hunt the Germans at night either. Generic username 769 says, I love your Nelson series. Do you think you'll do more Age of Sail videos in the future? Yeah, there are a few lined up. The Age of Sail is within the remit of the channel when it's requested. I'm planning something quite special for the last Nelson video. Not in this weather, but as and when it shakes down, we shall see what goes on and if that works. Husky the Dinosaur, what do you think of the last stand of HMAS Yara? That's planned for that's on my list of Wednesday videos. Shreko Kuvalo, sorry. Can a naval doctrine include building shipyards? Very definitely. Very, very definitely. In the sort of the never built French battleships little series of 5-minute guides I did recently, I pointed out that when it came to things like Gascogne and especially the Alsace designs, the whole naval doctrine behind what they were going to build was in part dictated by, do we have big enough shipyards, and if we don't, how much bigger do we have to build them? Ben Grogan, what difference between side versus bow launch slipways, and why are slipways preferred to building in a construction dry dock? Basically because a slipway is easier to make easier to build in the first place than a dry dock. A slipway is basically at its core, a slipway is a big, flat, angled, as in flat, as in level, not with bumps and everything in it, and inclined bit of ground. So that is much easier to do than an entire dry dock where you're having to dig down, line it, make sure it's the right size. Also, slipways are easier to enlarge than dry docks, assuming you have the space. And and with dry docks, you've also got to waterproof them, involve pumps and everything. So they're a lot more complex and expensive. With sides versus bow launch, the difference usually, to be honest, comes down to, do you have enough space? Because almost all slipways are not actually facing the sea or massive estuaries. They're usually in harbours or rivers. So it's less stressful on the ship to send it on a long linear launch slipway, i.e. usually stern first, as compared to side launching, where generally the tip off the side is a little bit more violent. But for a given size of waterway, you can launch something a heck of a lot bigger with a sideways launch than a linear launch. If you chuck something the size of a World War II treaty era battleship into anything but the largest of estuaries or harbours linearly, you need a heck of a lot of weight to stop it, or it's going to run aground on the other side. Whereas with a side launch, that's not so much of an issue. Thank you very much, Baza1382. Silver Fox 575, Tirpitz versus North Carolina in the Arctic. Depends on the period and the weather conditions. Early on, North Carolina is going to be quite limited in speed because of its vibration issues, which is going to be a bit of an issue. And also early on, although neither side's going to have radar-directed fire control, the Germans probably actually very early, maybe 42-ish, probably have a slight advantage in the radar department. As the war progresses, North Carolina begins to resolve its vibration issues, and it also gets more and more advanced radar and fire control systems. Now, obviously, the German radar and fire control systems also advance, but not quite as quickly. What was that? So, I would say marginally Tirpitz right at the start, were both ships coming into service, but North Carolina hauling ahead the further you go into the war. Code Monkey, what role did submarines play in the Dardanelles campaign, and were they effective? In the Dardanelles campaign specifically, they weren't too involved because it was very close confined waters, which are not good for submarines. In the overall Dardanelles campaign, there were a number of submarines that infiltrated their way up the Bosphorus and into the Black Sea, and they did actually have some fairly notable achievements, including sinking a couple of Ottoman warships. So, yeah, they were effective in the overall, but submarines can't really do all that much around Gallipoli. The Flying Knight 38 Gaming asks, how effective would the refit of Hood have been? If the refit had taken place, would that change her role, or would they send her to another fleet? There's a Wednesday video coming, probably September, maybe, looking at that. So, spoilers for that, but pretty effective is the answer. Robert Dennett. My mum always told me we were distant relations with a US Navy Admiral called Willis Augustus Lee. Did he exist and should I be proud? Off the top of my head, I don't know. Drop me an email, 5minuteguides@gmail.com, email in the About section. And yeah, drop me a line, remind me, and I'll have a dig round. Stale Meme Productions. If all the individual classes of US destroyers were to go into a battle royale in a calm sea, what class would win? If we're talking about gun destroyers, the Fletchers, because they're the most numerous and short of something like a gearing, they're also some of the most powerful. So between their numbers and their power, the Fletchers are going to come out on top. I really like the Fletchers. Jeffrey Papiers? Maybe. If the Polish Navy had convinced France to sell Strasbourg, Britannia, and two Galissoniere class cruisers, what effect could this force have had on the events of 1939 and or if they escaped to Britain? The events of 1939, probably not all that much because the Germans are mostly coming by land, and to be perfectly honest, if the Polish have those, you can guarantee they're going to be target number one for the Luftwaffe. I mean, as it was, the Luftwaffe made up fairly good inroads into some of the Polish Navy before they managed to escape. But if the Poles managed to extract those vessels to the UK, that could actually have a fairly significant impact. The two cruisers were on general purpose duties. I imagine probably sent to the Mediterranean. Britannia is probably going to be relegated to convoy escort. Strasbourg, of the four, Strasbourg is the big win. Because Strasbourg probably get actually initially sent down to the South Atlantic to go and give Admiral Graf Spee a bit of grief. The Battle of the River Plate would have ended very, very much differently if Strasbourg had been there, I can tell you that much. And then it would have come back. See, the thing is, with Strasbourg around, you can, instead of using Renown and Repulse on their own, you can probably form a hunting pack of either, because Hood's a bit broken down for this purpose, but you can probably form a hunting pack of at least any two of those. Probably, I would say, Renown and Strasbourg, a free Polish Strasbourg. And Renown probably formed some kind of hunting group to go off and be a lot more proactive about going after the Scharnhorsts during their commerce raiding. And probably, to be honest, with their speed and such, probably assigned to carrier escorts on Force H. Which does bring up the interesting scenario, potentially, of if you've got both Renown and Strasbourg escorting Ark Royal, by the time the Bismarck battle goes down, you may find them creatively misinterpreting certain orders since they're only 50, 60 miles away and going after Bismarck. Unexpected attack from another quarter in the middle of the Rodney King George V fight. Oh, great, now the rain's getting heavier. Galdir Ioni, twofold question. Favourite representation of sci-fi space naval combat, and have you ever read Weber's Honorverse? I haven't read the Honorverse novels. I'm tempted to look for some audiobook versions to listen to them, but I haven't read them. I've heard about them though. Favourite representation of sci-fi space naval combat? I would probably have to go with... Oh, what's his name? Hang on a second. I will go into my Audible library. Christopher G. Nuttall, Nuttall. He does a series called the Ark Royal series, which is set in space, and I do like that. I do like that a lot. The depictions of naval combat in there. Silver Fox 575. Happy Independence Day. Well, it's the 3rd, so... Well, Happy Independence Day to various American viewers. Tony Lovell, thank you very much. Ian Brannan, how would the Canadian light naval units hold up in a general fight against Japanese light units? Presumably this is World War II. Depends on the units. A lot of the Canadian light naval units were convoy escorts, so probably those not very well. But on the other hand, the Canadians did have some tribals, and well, Athabaskan, Haida, etc. Yeah, put the Canadian tribal flotilla up against some Japanese light units. That will be a nice way to rack up some kills. Philip Rux, have you ever read any records of what it's like when your station or ship gets hit by a main gun shell, especially World War I and World War II? Yes, and it's not pleasant. There'll be a few of those accounts coming up in the next few Wednesdays videos. For those of you who are on Patreon, you'll know what I'm talking about. For those of you who aren't, well, you'll see on Wednesday where we're going with that one. Arcade Jill Glad, assuming refit, how would a battle between Hood, Prince of Wales, Biscuit and Eugen have turned out? I think you meant Bismarck. I think your autocorrect betrayed you. Assuming that Hood's full refit had been done, that would have been a very interesting fight, because when I get round to doing the video on what sank the Hood, we'll go into more detail then. Fix your brakes, you muppet. Sorry, somebody just came past with their brake scream, and I think they've got their handbrake still on. Anyway. Yes. So if Hood's full refit had been done, then the hit that actually sank Hood almost certainly wouldn't have happened, or if it had happened, it wouldn't have had if the hit had occurred, it wouldn't have had the effect that it did. And there's a whole load of stuff that goes into that. But yeah, with more modern fire control systems and such like as well, it also means Hood is much more likely to start scoring hits. And actually, to be perfectly honest, if Hood's come out of refit with its full planned radar suite, they may actually pick up Bismarck and Prince Eugen earlier, and so the fight might not even develop along the kind of approach lines that the historical one would. But basically, yeah, it would be a lot nastier a fight. I mean, Bismarck is still tough and can still fight very hard, but yeah, with Hood being that bit more durable and a lot more accurate in its gunnery, yeah, you don't have to wargame it out, but there's a decent chance Hood could walk away from that one as the winner. The refit was big, trust me. Jade of Arc, Captain Horatio Hornblower, HMS Lydia versus Natividad. How accurate do you think it was for the sea battles at the time period of the 1951 movie? I've not seen the Hornblower 1951 movie, unfortunately. So drop me an email. I'll look up the movie, see if it's available on Amazon Prime or Netflix, and I will give you my opinion. Just remember to drop me an email so I remember. Slang name for the ship. Fair enough, Archangel Glen. Right, so that's those ones. Douwe van der Meer. The thing is, the hit that killed Hood, that from Bismarck, it was nothing to do with Hood's deck armor. I'll tell you that much for free. The hit that killed Hood absolutely zilch to do with penetrating Hood's deck armor. The fact that Hood was in the position it was in was due to fears of penetrating the deck armor at long range. But the actual hit itself was nothing in of that regard. Scooter GSP, how differently might have Midway turned out if Yamamoto had been in personal command of the carrier force aboard Yamato and travelling with the carriers? Well, he was a bit more decisive than Nagumo, but as I actually covered in the live stream I did with jingles on the World of Warships channel, and I think is in the collabs part of this channel. The main thing is Yamamoto has to decide on a target. Is he taking out Midway or is he taking out the American carriers? One or both. One or the other, not both. Ian Brannan, do you think HMS St. Lawrence effectively ended the War of 1812 on Lake Ontario, or do you think the Americans would eventually have countered her? It temporarily ended the war because it was just an outside context problem for the American squadron present. However, the Americans were building a couple of responses, and so that there was that, but also the British were building further ships to counter the American responses. So it was just kind of an escalation, the same way the whole war of 1812 on the Great Lakes had been. Bear in mind, the war starts out with both sides effectively having some heavily armed rowboats and ketches and a brig or two, and by the end they've got frigates and ships of the line coming down the line. So yeah, it's the Americans were in the middle of responding. Whoop. Yeah. Stop. Cease. What's going on? I'll come to that in a second. Sorry, it's just the chat's jumping around for some reason. Noob Lord, how would carriers with a damaged flight deck taking their aircrews again after their sorties? Depends where the flight deck is damaged. In World War II carriers, you can land aircraft on surprisingly short portions of the flight deck. So if the flight deck is damaged forward, it's not actually going to affect your ability to recover aircraft all that much. If you've got a massive hole right aft, actually the aircraft can try and overshoot it. The real problem is if you get a bomb in kind of the middle third of the ship, because then you don't quite have enough space either way. At that point, it's basically a case of either ditch and hope your destroyers can pick them up, or head for another carrier if you happen to have two. Joe Vandermeer, the thing is, when it comes to the sinking of HMS Hood, there are so many theories involved, and I mean, there's theories that it could even been sunk by Prince Eugen. There's theories about it hitting the torpedo tubes. There's theories about it being Hood itself basically self-destructing by accident. Hits all over the place on Hood. Was it fire that spread, etc.? So I can't really do it justice in a minute or in a few minutes responding on a live stream. All I can say is I can guarantee you that the deck armor was not the problem. A lot of people point to a diagram that was done before the war, which shows that it was possible to detonate Hood's magazine with a shell coming in and piercing the deck armor. What they miss is the fact that yes, that was true. However, when you look at the angle of descent of that shell, and then you look at the angle of descent of the shells that Bismarck was firing at Hood at the range that it was firing when Hood was destroyed, Bismarck shells would have been coming in at a lot shallower of an angle, and at that shallowness of angle, they're going to skip off the deck armor, or in extremis, if they somehow, by sort of if physics temporarily takes a short holiday and they somehow manage to get through, they're going to be slowed down, broken up, and detonate much higher in the ship, much shorter the magazine. So basically it's not really possible for there to be a magazine hit through the Hood's deck armor at the angle that Bismarck shells are coming in at the range that Hood was at when it was detonated. At longer range, fine, yes, it could happen. That's why Hood was coming in close, specifically to avoid that, and it had passed that danger point. That's why it was turning to unmask its guns. But yeah, lining up all the various theories and saying, well, this is what this theory thinks, this is how they think it could have happened, and this is the problem with why it probably didn't happen this way. That's the subject for this other video that I'm trying to create, but as I say, that's probably going to be the latter half of this year. Nagato 2044. Does Mr. Kinefel like the mine? And now there's running water. Fun. So yeah, Nagato 2044. Does Mr. Kinefel like the mine? Yes, she very much does like the mine. She's the one who chose its current little home over there. Noah Whitehouse suggested the Forrest Sherman class destroyer USS Davis to you. It was built almost immediately after World War II. Is that too late for a ship suggestion? So generally speaking, for ships for me to review, I usually put a cut-off date of 1950 for construction, and even then, to be honest, a ship, maybe something like the USS Worcester, is probably about the latest that I would be able to give you a full kind of 5-minute guide where I'd be completely happy with all the details, and be able to back up all the data. Something like a Forrest Sherman, I would be able to do a 5-minute guide on it, but when it comes to some of its later work and later equipment, missiles and such like, I would basically be saying it had these missiles. This is the thing. It's like if you talk to me about a Gearing class shore or a Worcester class cruiser, I can say, well, it's armed with these many 5-inch guns or this many 6-inch guns. But then if somebody in a question for a Drydock says, right, can you go into a bit more detail about the guns, then I can give you chapter and verse on how those guns worked. Whereas if you ask me about the Forrest Sherman, I'll be able to tell you that it had these missiles and they're claimed to have this range and this performance, but I'm not going to be able to give you the same kind of detail as follow-up. So yeah, I'd say it's on the margin. I've decided that due to one particular special request from a person who actually served aboard her, I will be at some point covering the Forrestal class carriers, but that is going to be an exception. And again, in a 5-minute guide, it's going to be more about the history and the background of the design and how it got built and what its initial operational capability was, rather than discussing the stuff that it might have gone ahead and done later on. And as Domar points out, Pelican 1984 points out, if you've got time and you have a hole in your flight deck, you would use steel plate and wood planks to try and patch the hole. It just depends on when that hole appears and how bad it is, because it might be a lot more than just a hole. Put it that way. You might end up with fires and explosions and stuff coming up from the hangar deck, which are a lot worse. The light level's not too bad still. That's quite surprising. Joe Don Ho, why are Minesweepers and Mine Layers separate ships? Wouldn't it be cheaper to combine the roles into one ship? Not really. Mine Layers generally have to be quite large and fast, because they usually are involved, obviously understandably, with trying to get to an enemy coast or near an enemy held territory, carry a lot of mines, drop them, and then run away as quickly as possible. Whereas a minesweeper doesn't have to be anywhere near as fast, especially once magnetic mines come into play. It has to be as non-magnetic and low profile as possible, with as shallow a draft as possible, usually as well, to try and avoid the deeper contact mines. But the mission profiles are entirely different. So, yeah. Sorry, it's just questions flipping around again. There we go. That's where we were. Kevin Favron asks, what made you fall in love with naval history? I have mentioned this before, so I'll just very, very briefly mention it. Basically being taken by my grandmother at the age of 4 to see HMS Victory on a rare sunny day in Portsmouth. And Angus O'Sonnell, playing a pacifist Germany in Hearts of Iron 4, I saw Japan invade the Philippines in March 1941 and the US take Tokyo in December 1941. Shortly after, Japan joined the Allies' battle against Russia. How feasible is that? Yeah, no. That's very much a game engine thing. If the Japanese have the Philippines in March 41, the US isn't putting... the US would be hard-pressed to put together a counter-invasion of the Philippines by December 41, let alone putting together a counter-invasion so successful it manages to take Tokyo by that point. Blown away. How would you handle the situation Admiral Carl Dorman found himself in the days leading up to and the eventual Battle of the Java Sea? Wow, that's a hard one. I wouldn't want to be in that situation. I think he probably did the best that he could. About the only thing I would probably do with future knowledge would be, one, I would brief everybody on just what the Long Lance can actually do, and two, I would probably then turn around and insist that everybody get some joint gunnery practice in ASAP to work out the various issues that existed in the Allied force, which led to them getting quite so horribly blown away. I mean, the chances that it affects the battle in a massively positive way is still relatively slim, but if I can get, say, like Exeter to fix the issues with her gunnery and so on and so forth, there is at least a chance I'll be doing damage and not quite taking quite the pasting that historically they did. Curium 96, would it be possible for Yamato to shell Midway? Yes. Whether it would do all that much is another matter. Apothecary Terry, which World War I, World War II ship which wasn't sunk would you least like to have served on? Seydlitz. That thing got battered repeatedly. I mean, Seydlitz is a very nice, very tough ship, but the amount of punishment she took, I do not want to be anywhere near that. Although not a warship, with the 45th anniversary of the sinking coming up in November, would you consider doing a video about the loss of SS Edmund Fitzgerald? Would consider it. I'd have to take a look into it. Josh Thomas Moore, what was Seymour good at or trained for? What he was good at was being Beatty's friend. At least until Beatty threw him under a bus. What was he trained for? Theoretically, he was partially trained for signals. He just hadn't been fully trained, and it showed. So yeah, he was supposed to be training to become a flag officer, as in the kind of signals and flags, kind of an adjutant to the command staff. But he's one of the people who was promoted beyond his competence or beyond his level of training. He really needed another couple of years to become a decent officer in the role that he was put into. Commie Tommy, would you ever consider covering the ships in the Falklands War? Way out of my channel specification, to be perfectly honest. Dr. Clark, Dr. Alexander Clark, A, knows a bit more about that conflict, and B, has contact with someone who knows an awful lot more about that conflict. I'm happy to provide my input if he wanted to do a collaboration video, if we organised a collaboration video, but it would be very much led by him rather than me doing it on this channel. I would basically be an adjutant to the video providing input, but I would rely on him and the other expert I mentioned, to provide kind of the meat to that particular conflict. Plane Nut 767 asks, any future videos on smaller ships like patrol and landing boats planned? Yeah, eventually. So just to reference, it's 9:10 here in the UK. It is, I believe, getting dark. I think even the cameras realise that. Oh no, the camera still thinks it's fairly light. That's not too bad. So I'm going to do another, probably, let's say 5 to 10 minutes of questions, and then I'm going to wrap it up there, because 2 and a bit hours. I'm beginning to run out of iron brew. So this is basically my measure of how long live streams last. 1 bottle of iron brew is the limit, because then either I have to go wandering off and find another one, or my voice dies, and then I can't record other videos. Coltax 100. Could all British pre-dreadnoughts, if equipped, defeat the High Seas Fleet at Jutland? That's a lot of pre-dreadnoughts. Probably not, unless they'd all been modernised, because a lot of them won't have the fire control equipment necessary to engage at the ranges that the High Seas Fleet can engage at, and with the age of a lot of them, they're also going to be slower considerably, even with the Deutschlands attached to the High Seas Fleet. So it'll be far too easy for Shear to pick off sections of them, outmaneuver and outgun them. Now, if you sort of magically repair them all up to full original operational capability, equip them with the latest fire control equipment and such like, they're still going to have speed issues, but then there's a lot of guns present, and a lot of individual ships. So, yeah, I'm not sure. I wouldn't put money on it. I'd certainly put money on a like fully upgraded, fully updated pre-dreadnought fleet of doing a lot of damage, but yeah, I wouldn't bet on it. Scooter GSP. If Hood hadn't been sunk so dramatically with such great loss of life, could the Royal Navy's response have been somewhat less intense and allowed the Bismarck, if not to escape, then have more survivors? Depends if Hood is sunk or not. If Hood is sunk, even if it's more slowly and less dramatically, then it's still probably going to be a case of hunt down and kill the Bismarck the same way it was historically. If Hood's damaged and has to break off the action, then and Bismarck just leaves because of that, then yeah, in theory at that point you might see something more along the lines of the efforts to hunt down Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and then Bismarck might then make it back to France. They wouldn't be basically pulling out every single stop possible. Nagato 2044. If Nagato was built as an aircraft carrier in the 1920s, would she be better off in the Pacific War? Would she be more useful? Yes. She'd probably be like a slightly smaller version of Kaga. So, I mean, she's still going to be a battleship-derived carrier, so somewhat slower than ideal for a fleet carrier. But let's face it, Nagato didn't actually end up doing all that much outside of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, or Battle of Samar. So yeah, if she's a carrier, a reasonably substantial one, assuming that they can get her speed up in the same way that they slightly boosted Kaga's speed, she's probably going to be operating with a Kido Butai. And at that point, yeah, she would be pretty useful for them, especially as a sort of a long-term carrier, something that's built in from the 1920s. She's going to have a lot of experienced air crew and operational theory behind her. Jonathan Brady, would you ever do a series on famous civilian vessels? Maybe eventually. There's plenty of warships to do. Maybe one or two of the really, really important, big, important ones like Titanic. CD, how the heck do you produce so much content, Drac? Mostly functioning eidetic memory, massive library of books, and now a relatively fast PC, basically. The sheer amount of reading that I've done over the years helps greatly on that. Versus Arch, had the Japanese somehow had sufficient scouting? Oh, I think you're having a discussion with somebody. Okay, that's cool. Okay, so last few questions then, and then I'll briefly... Oh, never mind. So let's say last few questions. Tevildo asks, why do late 19th and early 20th centuries ships have vestigial masts? They can't be used for propulsion, and radar wasn't invented at that point. Lookout points and gunnery control, once you get to the latter part of the 19th and early 20th century, pretty much for the same reasons, because you can see quite far, and flag signalling. The bases of the mast were used as anchor points for boat cranes, and say flag signals, radio antennas for communications, searchlight platforms, anti-torpedo boat platforms. There were quite a few things they used the masts for that weren't sails. And to be perfectly honest, in the late 19th century, there were still a few at least auxiliary sail-powered ships on the smaller scale of warships. Jeffrey Papiers asks, I recently read an alternate history where the Polish and Estonian navies evacuate their entire strength to Finland upon their country's invasions. Could such a combined force inflict any significant damage in the Winter War? Presumably fighting the Russians? Main thing is the Russians didn't really do much navally in the Winter War. You're certainly not going to go after them in their home waters. Yeah, I mean, having such a naval force there might provoke the Russians into doing something, but to be honest, the Russian Navy missed completely a big feint that was designed to distract them. So, and that was when the Finnish Navy was cooperating with the Kriegsmarine. So, I think with the best will in the world, the Polish and Estonian navies would be much better off heading over to the UK. They're not going to accomplish that much operating out of Finnish ports, to be perfectly honest. Thank you. Yeah. A person with a name that I was definitely going to struggle with and says, you may call me George. Why did the Soviets trash Royal Sovereign in just a few months operating her? Logistics problems, war priorities, or the ship's age? Basically, they had other priorities to deal with. Royal Sovereign was a little bit on the old side. It wasn't in terrible condition when it was loaned to them as Archangelisk. I think that's how you pronounce it. But the thing is, the Arctic is a very, very harsh environment to operate in. And yeah, unless you continuously operate and maintain the ship, the Arctic's going to do a heck of a number to it very quickly. A lot of ships that say went on the Arctic convoys usually required a short, even just a dockside refit when they got back from those missions. So continuous or near continuous operations in that environment for months at a time is really going to do a number on the ship. And the Russians just didn't have the facilities in those northern waters to maintain or repair and refit a ship of that size. All their prior battleship building and operational experience was in the Baltic and Black Seas. So, yeah, probably not the wisest of ideas, to be honest. Ian Brandon, was the Graf Zeppelin worth Germany finishing? Not really, to be perfectly honest. It's a carrier, yes, and in theory you can construct scenarios where it might be very useful, but what is it going to do really? It's in the European campaigns it's not particularly useful because the Luftwaffe's right there. Even in the Norwegian campaign, I mean, it's not going to be ready in time for that, but even if it was, it has a marginal effect on providing the Germans with a bit of air support, like a day or two before they get it historically. It's anywhere that the Germans want to operate around the time or after the Graf Zeppelin could reasonably have been completed, they're going to have Luftwaffe air cover, which means air cover in much greater numbers and with much greater reliability. So, yeah, there's not really much point to it other than operating out in the Atlantic, and trying to force a carrier out into the Atlantic past the Royal Navy is hugely risky. Trying to force anything out is risky, but yeah. I have hypothesized before about theoretical uses for the Graf Zeppelin where you could potentially have it have a reasonably successful commerce raiding career, but that's very much hypothetical and very much relies on everything going right. Although, as Jonatas Pereira points out, the secondary batteries are probably the most useful part. Do a phantom? That is quite funny. Yes. Well, yeah. If people wonder whether historians are perhaps different from everybody else, I'm not the best person to ask. I will quite happily admit I am a little bit of an odd fish when it comes to most things in life. I've somehow managed to survive a lot of very weird and interesting situations that this thing, obviously everyone's life experience is their own life experience. My life experience, I was like, well, that's life, that's what happens. That was interesting, that was boring, that was good, that was bad. But when I start telling people about my life experiences, a lot of people are like, oh, how on earth did you manage to do all of this? Why have you done this, and do you need help? Kinds of things. So yeah, asking me whether historians are normal people or different from others is probably I'm not the right person to be asking. Bear in mind, you're talking to somebody who is simultaneously a civil and transport engineer in a local authority, curates a naval history channel, and when we aren't in the middle of lockdown, goes out quite happily wearing 25 to 30 kilos of steel plate and bashes people over the heads with swords for fun at the weekends and doing medieval reenactments. So I'm probably not your typical person, unfortunately, or even necessarily a typical historian. Actually, that'd be interesting. Naval historians having to resolve their differences by one-on-one combat related to their field. Now that would be fun. I disagree about the English formation at Agincourt, alright? Both of you into plate armour. Here's a sword and a shield 10 paces away from each other. Turn and beat the living daylights out of each other. The last one standing is the correct person. Oh dear. Jimmy Jams. Were there black people employed on British warships before World War II, and how were they treated? Yes, quite a few actually. I made this point actually in the Nelson video. There's quite a large number of various different nationalities in the Royal Navy, especially in the Age of Sail. It does drop off a little bit during the peacetime period of the 19th century. Picks back up again in the sort of the 20th century. There are obviously cultural issues, shall we say, about how they're treated in some aspects and some respects, but they are around various ethnicities in the Royal Navy. And to be perfectly honest, at least in somewhere like the Royal Navy, when you're at sea in a small metal box with several dozen or several hundred other people, you can't afford to keep prejudices going like that forever and a day. How people deal with them and how they relate to each other will probably use terms and phraseology and jokes and stuff that a lot of people today would throw their hands up in horror over, but at the same time, everyone kind of got on with it. It's something I've read about in passing, so precise details are probably best served looking to someone who's looked into that specifically. But they certainly were around, and from what I can tell, although obviously there is the prejudices you have at the time, it's certainly nothing as bad as what you might expect, especially given the way some people go on about things these days. But that's treading far too close to modern politics for my liking, so let's go to another question in the 3 minutes that I have arbitrarily decided we have left. Edgar Saldivar, when is the next warship design Spring Sharp challenge? I have been a little bit remiss in announcing that. I will announce that in Drydock episode 102. So yeah, Drydock episode 102, so it's just a fraction over a week away. Dark Lord Bane, who's your favourite Sci-fi Admiral and who do you think is best? Oh, Sci-fi Admiral. You said Sci-fi Captain, that would be one thing. Sci-fi Admiral. Whew. There's not too many of those. Let me think. I can't think off the top of my head of too many actual sci-fi admirals. I mean, there's Admiral Ross from Star Trek Deep Space Nine, but most of the action in various sci-fi shows tends to follow captains. Actually, well, if you term Admiral as in person in charge of a large fleet of ships, then I'm going to go with General Martok. I like General Martok. Also from Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Oh yeah, Thrawn, Admiral Thrawn. How did I forget about him? Still, if you put me between Thrawn and Martok, I prefer Martok. He's more fun. Thrawn, I'd always feel on edge about what cunning plan is he going to have next. Admiral Martok is just like, he's either going to punch someone or drink them under the table. One of the two. Scooter GSP, one last question then. I've heard that one of the factors that helped the Japanese excel at night operations was they had binoculars with exceptional low light optics, even by today's standards. Any details? They did have some very, very nice optics. Very nice optics. The Japanese and the Italians actually pretty much perfected optical fire control as best it was going to get. That's not to say the other nations couldn't have done it, but the thing was, by sort of the mid World War II and onward period, almost everybody else was using radar first as a sort of secondary assistant, and then as a primary part of their long distance spotting. And so the drive to constantly improve the optics was slightly reduced in those nations, as opposed to in like Italy and Japan, where they didn't really have a functioning radar program for a long period of the time, so they had to make those last few generational steps. So, and it's just gone half past, so it's 2.5 hours. James Trivett, so you just don't care about Minneapolis? I don't know what that means. What's that about Minneapolis? I'm confused now. And okay, so very last two questions. Jonatas Pereira. Oh, sorry, tongue's run away. Did you hear about the game called Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts? Yes, I did. I've done 2 or 3 live streams about it. I'll probably do another one in a few weeks' time, maybe towards the end of this month. And Coltax 100. What if HMS Warspite replaced the British fleet at Trafalgar? Lots of explosions and pain, because the Franco-Spanish fleet can't do anything to it. And yet they can't do anything to it to the point that probably even running out of ammunition isn't a problem, because they can just sail up very close, near enough point-blank range, and probably sink most of them with a secondary battery. Save the primary battery for the bigger ships, bigger targets, the first rates and such. So yeah, I'm going to... All this box really is coming apart. Yeah, so that's it. I'm going to call it there. And so thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for watching. And you'll see the rest of Drydock episode 101 on Sunday. And yeah, hopefully maybe next live stream I'll have a little bit more talk about these lovely gun turrets and a few other bits and pieces, and the glass slides that are in that box. And of course the mine also says goodbye. And I will try and arrange for the next live stream on a 1, not so rainy day, and 2, I'll actually get the lamps out of the shed that I was going to use to make sure I don't disappear into the darkness. So with all of that said and done, thank you very much, and I hope to see you again on another live stream war video at some point.